The sound of a gavel striking a mahogany block in a Detroit courtroom on July 18, 2013, was not merely a judicial punctuation. It was the cracking of a tectonic plate that runs beneath the entire Western world. On that humid Tuesday morning, Kevin Orr, the emergency manager for the city of Detroit, filed for the largest municipal bankruptcy in American history, carrying an $18 billion price tag. But the true horror wasn't in the aggregate number, nor in the camera flashes illuminating the weary faces of city attorneys. The true horror was found in the granular reality of the retired librarian, the 60-year-old sanitation worker, and the widowed schoolteacher, who woke up to discover that the mathematical certainty of their pensiona promise etched in contract and sweat was practically worth zero. They were told they might receive pennies on the dollar. The safe money, the money that was supposed to be immune to market volatility and corporate greed, had evaporated into the ether of actuarial mismanagement and political kick-can strategies. At the time, the mainstream financial press treated Detroit as an anomaly, a chaotic outlier caused by local corruption and industrial decay. They were wrong. Detroit was not an anomaly, it was a prologue. It was a localized simulation of a global event that is currently scheduled by federal statute to arrive on the doorstep of the American middle class in the early 2030s. What we witnessed in the ruins of the Motor City is exactly what is happening, in slow motion, to the Social Security Trust Fund and the vast majority of public and private pension funds across the OECD. We are living through the final stages of the greatest Ponzi scheme ever devised, not by a criminal mastermind in a penthouse, but by the benevolent architecture of the welfare state itself. The premise of the modern retirement system relies on a specific demographic geometry, a pyramid where a broad base of young workers supports a narrow peak of retirees. When Otto von Bismarck introduced the world's first state pension in Imperial Germany in 1889, the retirement age was set at 70. The average life expectancy was roughly 45. The mathematics worked because the system was designed to pay out only to the genetic outliers who survived the gauntlet of 19th century industrial life. It was an insurance policy against catastrophic longevity, not a 30-year paid vacation. Today, that geometry has inverted. We are no longer looking at a pyramid. We are looking at a skyscraper balancing on its needle. The base has eroded due to collapsing birth rates, and the top has expanded due to medical miracles. We are attempting to support a massive heavy aging population on the shoulders of a shrinking, debt-burdened workforce, and the accountants have finally admitted that the ledger is bleeding out. To understand why 2033 is not an arbitrary date but a mathematical cliff edge, we must peel back the layers of bureaucratic euphemisms that obscure the reality of the Social Security Administration. The trust fund does not exist in the way a normal person understands a trust fund. There is no vault in West Virginia filled with gold bars or diversified equity portfolios waiting to be liquidated for your golden years. According to the Social Security Board of Trustees' 2024 annual report, specifically within the dry prose of Table 2D3, the assets held by the fund consist entirely of specially issued Treasury securities. These are IOUs. The government tax revenue collected from your paycheck was spent the moment it arrived, spent on wars, healthcare, infrastructure, and interest on previous debt. In its place, the Treasury placed a piece of paper in a filing cabinet promising to pay that money back later. But here's the terrifying recursive loop. The only way the government can pay back those IOUs to the Social Security Administration is by taxing the future workforce or borrowing more money from the public. It is a liability masquerading as an asset. As of the latest projections, the combined asset reserves of the Old Age and Survivors Insurance and Disability Insurance (OASI-ND) trust funds are projected to become depleted during 2033. At that moment, continuing income to the program would be sufficient to pay only 79% of scheduled benefits. This is not a political opinion, this is arithmetic. The crisis is compounded by the behavior of the bond market, the quiet behemoth that dwarfs the stock market in size and significance. For 40 years, from 1981 to 2021, pension funds operated on easy mode. This was the era of the Great Moderation, where interest rates trended strictly downward, pushing bond prices upward. A pension fund manager could simply buy a 10-year U.S. Treasury or a bundle of corporate bonds and look like a genius, as the capital appreciation swelled the fund's assets. This created a dangerous illusion of solvency. It allowed states like Illinois and California, and nations like France and Italy, to make extravagant promises to public sector unions based on projected returns of 7 or 8% returns that were risk-free only in a rearview mirror. That era died violently in 2022, when the Federal Reserve, under Jerome Powell, embarked on the most aggressive rate-hiking cycle in 4 decades to combat inflation. They shattered the structural foundation of the pension system. As rates rose, the value of the bonds sitting in those pension portfolios collapsed. We saw the first casualty of this dynamic not in the U.S., but in the United Kingdom in September 2022. During the brief and disastrous premiership of Liz Truss, the gilt crisis of 2022 is a perfect case study for the fragility of this system. UK pension funds had engaged in liability-driven investment (LDI) strategies, essentially using leverage to squeeze yield out of boring government bonds. When bond yields spiked, These funds faced massive margin calls. They were forced to sell assets into a falling market, creating a doom loop that threatened to insolvencize the entire British pension system within hours. The Bank of England was forced to intervene, printing £65 billion to buy the bonds and stop the bleeding. This was the canary in the coal mine. It revealed that the only thing keeping the pension promises alive is the central bank's willingness to debase the currency to bail out the system. This brings us to the core of the dilemma, the two engines of destruction. Engine 1 is the demographic reality of the baby boomer generation retiring en masse, shifting from being net buyers of assets, stocks, bonds, to net sellers to fund their consumption. This creates a persistent headwind for asset prices. Engine 2 is the monetary response. To prevent a nominal default, where checks simply stop coming, governments will choose the path of least resistance. They will print the difference. The convergence of these forces creates a scenario that few are prepared for, because it defies the recency bias of the last 40 years. We are moving toward a period of financial repression, a term coined by economists Carmen Reinhart and M. Bellin Sprancia to describe how governments liquidate their debt burdens by keeping interest rates below the rate of inflation. This is the silent theft. If inflation is running at 5% and your pension fund is holding bonds yielding 4%, the purchasing power of that pool of capital is shrinking every single year. The nominal value might remain the same. You might still get a check for $2,000 a month, but that check will buy half of what it did a decade prior. This is the insidious nature of the crisis. It likely won't look like a sudden Mad Max collapse. It will look like the slow, grinding misery of the 1970s, but with much worse demographics. The 2033 deadline for Social Security is merely the headline event. The rot is systemic. Look at the underfunded liabilities of state and local pensions in the United States. Estimates from the American Legislative Exchange Council ALEC place unfunded public pension liabilities at nearly $6 trillion. That is $6 trillion that has been promised to police officers, firefighters, and teachers that simply does not exist. When the convergence hits, the market will witness a massive liquidation event. Pension funds are the largest holders of assets in the world. As they become cash flow negative, paying out more in benefits to retirees than they take in from current workers, they become forced sellers. They will have to sell stocks, they will have to sell real estate, and they will have to sell bonds. Who buys when the largest whale in the ocean is selling? This structural selling pressure acts as a ceiling on the stock market and a floor under interest rates. The passive investing revolution, where millions of people blindly dump money into S&P 500 index funds, assumes that there will always be a bid. But demographics suggest that the great wealth transfer we hear so much about will not be a transfer of assets to millennials, but a transfer of assets to healthcare providers and nursing homes, liquidated to pay for end-of-life care. The money doesn't trickle down. It evaporates into the service sector. Furthermore, we must consider the geopolitical dimension of this debt. For decades, the U.S. could export its inflation because foreign nations China, Japan, Saudi Arabia had an insatiable appetite for U.S. treasuries. They bought our debt, which funded our pension promises. That dynamic is reversing. The geopolitical fracturing of the world, driven by the weaponization of the dollar and the rise of the BRICS bloc, means that foreign central banks are no longer automatic buyers of Western debt. In fact, they are net sellers. The Treasury International Capital Tick data shows a clear trend of diversification away from U.S. debt by major foreign holders. This leaves the domestic pension funds and the Federal Reserve as the buyers of last resort. It is an incestuous loop. The government issues debt to pay pensions. The pensions buy the debt, and the central bank prints money to ensure the pensions can afford the debt. It is a perpetual motion machine of currency destruction. This brings us to the philosophical precipice. The concept of retirement is a historical aberration. For 99% of human history, you worked until you were physically unable, and then you were cared for by your extended family, or you died. The idea that you could work for 35 years, contribute a small percentage of your income, and then spend the next 30 years playing golf and traveling the world was a unique product of the post-World War II economic anomaly, a period of cheap energy, favorable demographics, and the Pax Americana. That period is over. The social contract is broken, not because politicians are evil, though many are incompetent, but because the physics of the system no longer hold. We are returning to the historical mean. The implications of this are profound. It means that the reliance on third-party custodians for your survival is a strategy fraught with existential risk. If your plan for the future relies on a counterparty, be it the government, a union, or an insurance company keeping a promise that is mathematically impossible to keep, you are not investing. You are gambling. The realization of this reality should not induce panic, but rather a cold, focused clarity. The 2033 bankruptcy is not a prediction of the end of the world. It is a prediction of the end of an illusion. Those who understand this shift are moving their capital out of the paper promise economy and into the hard asset economy. They are prioritizing assets that cannot be printed by a central bank and liabilities that cannot be inflated away. They understand that in a world of sovereign insolvency, the only true equity is ownership of productive capacity, scarce resources, and direct custody of value. We are witnessing the separation of the economy into two distinct spheres: the political economy, which will continue to manipulate data, suppress yields, and manage the nominal decline, and the real economy, where the laws of supply and demand still function, however brutally. The window to position oneself on the right side of this transfer is closing. The history of financial crises, from the assignats of revolutionary France to the collapse of the Soviet ruble, teaches us that the majority of the population remains in denial until the very moment the bank doors fail to open. They trust the authority figures who assure them that the system is sound, that the trust fund is solvent, and that the checks will never stop coming. And strictly speaking, they are right. The checks will likely not stop. The government will print the money to send them. But when that envelope arrives in your mailbox in 2033, the question will not be whether the number on the check matches the promise. The question will be whether that number can buy a loaf of bread, a tank of gas, or a frantic hour of dignity in a collapsing healthcare system. The ledger always balances. It balances through honest repayment, or it balances through the dishonest default of inflation. The choice has already been made. The timeline is the only variable left to resolve, but the deception does not stop at government debt. To fully grasp the magnitude of the 2033 event, one must look into the dark corners of the private pension funds and their desperate hunt for yield. Over the last decade, as interest rates on safe government bonds hovered near zero, pension fund managers faced a crisis of mathematics. They needed a 7% annual return to meet their future obligations to you, but the market was offering them 2%. To bridge this gap, they did not reduce their promises. They increased their risk. They migrated en masse into the opaque world of alternative investments, specifically private equity and commercial real estate. According to data from the Pew Charitable Trusts, state pension funds have more than doubled their allocation to alternative investments since 2006, with some funds having over 30% of their entire portfolio locked in these illiquid assets. This is the valuation trap. Unlike public stocks, which are priced every second by the market, private equity assets are priced by the managers themselves, often using mark-to-model accounting. This is essentially a sophisticated guessing game where the fund manager decides what the asset is worth. It creates a volatility laundering effect, where the pension fund appears stable on paper because the assets are never marked down to their true liquidation value. We are currently witnessing the slow-motion implosion of the commercial real estate sector, driven by the structural shift to remote work and the rise in refinancing costs. Yet, if you look at the books of major pension funds, many still carry these office towers at 2019 valuations. This is a hallucination. When the liquidity crunch hits in the early 2030s and these funds are forced to sell these assets to pay retirees, they will discover that a building valued at $100 million on their balance sheet is only worth $40 million in the actual market. That 60% air pocket is where your retirement security vanishes. The convergence of the sovereign debt crisis and the private asset bubble brings us to the inevitable policy response. Yield curve control, YCC. We have seen this movie before, specifically between 1942 and 1951, when the Federal Reserve capped long-term Treasury yields to help the U.S. government finance World War II. We are seeing it again now in Japan, where the Bank of Japan has spent decades fighting the market to keep the 10-year yield suppressed. In the United States, as the interest expense on the national debt climbs past $1 trillion, annually exceeding the entire defense budget, the Federal Reserve will face a binary choice: allow rates to rise and bankrupt the U.S. government, or cap rates and destroy the dollar. History dictates they will choose the dollar's destruction. They will implement a form of financial repression where they artificially hold interest rates below the rate of inflation. This is the engine that drives the wealth transfer. If inflation is allowed to run hot at 6, 7, or 8%, while bonds pay 4%, the real value of the debt decreases. It is a tax on savers and wage earners to bail out the state. This environment creates a bifurcated reality. For the wealthy, who own scarce assets like real estate, equities, and gold, the inflation pushes the nominal prices of their assets higher, preserving their purchasing power. For the middle class and retirees dependent on fixed income, it is a massacre. Their cost of living explodes while their income stagnates. This is not a bug in the system. It is the feature designed to keep the sovereign solvent. This creates a sociological pressure cooker that goes beyond mere economics. When the social contract of work hard, save money, retire with dignity is violated, the political ramifications are explosive. We must look at the yellow vest protests in France or the unrest in Chile as precursors. In both cases, the spark was a relatively minor economic policy change, but the fuel was a deep-seated realization that the standard of living was collapsing. By 2033, as the Social Security Trust funds hit zero and private pensions/benefits, we will likely see the rise of extreme populism on both the left and the right. The demand will be for universal basic income, or modern monetary theory stimulus to fill the void left by the pension collapse. This, in turn, accelerates the monetary debasement engine. It is a feedback loop. The system fails, the government prints money to patch the failure. The printing causes inflation, the inflation destroys more of the pension's real value, and the system fails again. The currency becomes the release valve for all of society's accumulated bad promises. The German hyperinflation of 1923 was not caused by a mysterious economic virus. It was a political decision to print marks, to pay striking workers in the Ruhr, and to service war reparations. The mechanics are identical today. Only the scale is global. We must also confront the technological deflationary force that is colliding with this inflationary monetary policy. This is the two engines framework in its most violent form. On one side, we have artificial intelligence and automation, which are inherently deflationary. They lower the cost of goods and services and reduce the demand for labor. In a healthy money system, this would result in falling prices and a higher standard of living for everyone. But in a debt-based fiat system, deflation is the enemy. The central banks are terrified of falling prices because it makes the debt burden harder to service. Therefore, the more technology pushes prices down, the harder the central banks must print money to push prices up. We are entering a war between the exponential efficiency of technology and the exponential debasement of currency. The result is Cantillon confusion, where the price of essential goods, food, energy, housing skyrockets due to monetary expansion, while the price of non-essential tech goods, televisions, software collapses. You will be able to afford a 90-inch 8,000 screen to watch your net worth evaporate, but you will struggle to afford the electricity to power it. This creates a Gibson-esque paradox. Scenario where we see high inflation and low growth simultaneously, a stagflationary trap that traditional Keynesian economics has no toolkit to solve. The solution, or rather the survival strategy, requires a complete inversion of the portfolio allocation models taught in business schools for the last 40 years. The 60-40th portfolio, 60% stocks, 40% bonds is dead. It relied on the negative correlation between stocks and bonds. When stocks went down, bonds went up, providing a cushion. In an inflationary environment, that correlation turns positive. Both stocks and bonds fall together. As we saw in 2022, the new paradigm demands an allocation to level 1 assets on Exter's pyramid. John Exter, a central banker and economist, visualized the financial system as an inverted pyramid. At the wide top are the riskiest, most leveraged assets, derivatives, unfunded liabilities, and junk bonds. At the narrow bottom is the only asset with no counterparty risk, gold. During a liquidity crisis, capital flees from the top of the pyramid down to the bottom. We are already seeing the smart money make this move. Central banks themselves, specifically those in the global, East, China, Poland, Singapore, India, are buying gold at the fastest pace since 1967. They are implicitly acknowledging that the U.S. Treasury bond is no longer the risk-free reserve asset of the world. They are moving their savings from promises to pay to payment itself. This pivot to hard assets extends beyond gold. It encompasses energy, arable land, and industrial commodities. We are entering a commodity supercycle driven by decades of underinvestment in the old economy. While capital was chasing software unicorns and crypto tokens, we neglected to dig the mines and drill the wells necessary to sustain civilization. The green energy transition, ironically, is the most commodity-intensive endeavor in human history. To build the wind turbines, solar panels, and electric vehicle batteries mandated by governments, we need massive amounts of copper, nickel, silver, and lithium. Yet the supply of these metals is constrained by geology and politics. We are facing a structural supply deficit that no amount of money printing can solve. You cannot print a pound of copper. You cannot quantitative ease a barrel of oil into existence. This physical scarcity will clash with the monetary abundance, leading to violent price spikes in the things we actually need to survive. The investor of the 2030s will not ask what is the PE ratio, but rather do you actually have the inventory. The financialization of the economy is reversing. The tangibilization of the economy has begun. The philosophical implications of this shift are profound. We are moving from an era of trust to an era of verification. For 50 years, the global economy ran on trust in the Fed, trust in the government, trust in the pension funds. That trust was a luxury afforded by peace and surplus. As we enter an era of conflict and scarcity, that trust is evaporating. This is not a pessimistic view. It is a reversion to the historical norm. The unique period of stability Americans enjoyed from 1980 to 2020 was the exception, not the rule. The return to history brings with it the return of historical risks, including currency collapse, capital controls, and wealth confiscation. The discussion of central bank digital currencies, CBDCs, must be viewed through this lens. Governments are aware of the coming pension insolvency. They know they cannot pay what they promised in valuable currency. The implementation of CBDCs is not about technological advancement or faster payments. It is about control. It provides the mechanism to implement negative interest rates, to expire money if it is not spent, and to automatically deduct taxes and fines. It is the ultimate tool of financial repression, designed to trap capital within the burning system so it cannot escape into hard assets or foreign jurisdictions. The war on cash and the regulatory crackdown on Bitcoin are the opening salvos in this battle to fence in the herd before the shearing begins. However, amidst this gloom, there lies a tremendous asymmetric opportunity for the individual who pays attention. The market is currently mispricing risk on a colossal scale. It is still pricing in a return to the low inflation, low rate world of the 2010s. It is pricing in a soft landing. It is ignoring the actuarial cliff of 2033. This disconnect is where fortunes are made. Those who position themselves in scarce, tangible assets before the herd panics will see a transfer of wealth of historic proportions. It is similar to buying insurance on a house that everyone else believes is fireproof, while you are standing in the basement watching the electrical wiring spark. The cost of protection is currently cheap because the consensus is complacent. But the window is narrowing. The Minsky moment, the point where a sudden collapse in asset values occurs, happens not when the fundamentals deteriorate, but when the psychology shifts. When the average pensioner realizes that his check will not cover his heating bill, the psychology will shift overnight. The rush for the exits will be chaotic, and the door is very small. We must also reconsider the definition of wealth itself. In the coming decade, wealth will not be defined by the number of digits on a screen in a banking app. It will be defined by resilience and autonomy. It will be measured in your ability to withstand a systemic shock without losing your standard of living. This means owning your home without a mortgage, having direct access to energy and food sources, and holding assets that do not rely on a functioning electrical grid or a solvent banking sector to have value. It is a shift from financial maximization to survival optimization. The fragility of the just-in-time supply chain and the highly leveraged financial system means that disruption is the new baseline. The person who holds physical gold coins, who has a productive garden, who has a network of trusted community relationships. Market. These are the tremors before the earthquake. The Detroit retiree in 2013 did not see the bankruptcy filing coming, but the signs were there for years. The declining population, the rising debt service costs, the desperate borrowing to pay current bills. The United States is currently Detroit writ large. The scale is different, but the trajectory is identical. Ultimately, the story of the 2033 bankruptcy is a story about the consequences of magical thinking. We believed we could legislate prosperity. We believed we could print value. We believed we could defy the laws of demographics. Reality, as Philip K. Dick famously said, is that which, when you stop believing in it, doesn't go away. The math of the pension crisis is not going away. It is waiting. The gavel that struck in Detroit is raised again, casting a long shadow over the entire Western world. When it falls this time, it will not just close a case, it will close an era. The question is not whether the system will break. The system is already broken. We are merely waiting for the news to arrive. The only question that remains is where you and your family will be standing when the illusion of safety finally dissolves, and the raw, cold air of reality rushes in to fill the vacuum. Will you be a creditor to a bankrupt state, holding empty promises? Or will you be the sovereign owner of your own destiny? The clock is ticking, the ledger is balancing, and the time for preparation is nearly over.